On the agenda tonight, we're going back to the early 60s to take a look at the Mills Brothers, and they're going to be performing Paper Doll. Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus, and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. So I don't actually have a date for this performance, so I'm placing it at the very early 60s, maybe 1960, 1961, around that kind of time. But maybe you guys in the comment section, if you do have a date for this performance, it would be great, and then I can add it in the description. But let's get the guys up on screen and let's see how they get on.
But here's an old song. Lawrence, I think you said it was your favorite, Paper Doll. I'm gonna buy a paper doll, but all that I lose cannot steal. I do not blame you. And then the flirty, flirty guys with their flirty, flirty eyes will have to flirt with dollies that are real. When I come home at night, she will be waiting. Oh, will she? She'll be the truest doll in all this world. I'd rather have a paper doll to call my own than have a fickle-minded real live girl. I guess I had $1 million or more. I guess I played the whole game over and over. I just quarreled with Sue, and that's why I'm blue. She's gone away and left me just like all dolls do. I'll tell you boys, it's tough to be alone, and it's tough to love a doll that's not your own. I'm through with all of them. I'm never for to get say, boy, what you gonna do? I'm going to buy a paper doll that I can call my own, and all that other fellows cannot steal. And then the flirty, flirty guys with their flirty, flirty eyes will have to flirt with dollies that are real. When I come home at night, she will be waiting. She'll be the truest doll in all this world. I'd rather have a paper doll to call my own than have a fickle-minded real live girl.
And there we have it. When we're talking about the Mills Brothers, we are going way back, 1930s. Around that time, this was, I think, in the 60s, early 60s, like I said. So it is quite a while afterwards, and they actually say in this video that this is an old song because they're referring back to when this was a huge hit. Just to give a reference point as to when Paper Doll was released, it was in 1943, and it was a monster hit when it was released. It sold over 6 million copies, and they actually recorded it in just 15 minutes in the studio. But I love the setup here as well with the full band. Interestingly, something that the Mills Brothers used to do is imitate the instruments that they heard on the radio. And when they did record in the studio, sometimes they put on their actual records that there's only a guitar in this arrangement. The other instruments were just the guys just simulating those instruments with their mouths. And it all came about from one of their first auditions where they forgot one of the instruments, a kazoo, I think, and then had to simulate some of the instruments by holding their hands over their mouths. So a really interesting way that it all started up, but it was obviously good enough to accompany their voices to make it sound like there were instruments in the background. We'll probably get into a little bit of the history at the end of this video, but as you can see in this performance, they are performing as a trio. They were originally a quartet, and it's Norman Brown playing the guitar here, by the way. He's just accompanying them, and sadly, they lost their brother, which was John Jr. in 1936, very early on, and their father, John Sr., then joined the band, or took over in order to complete that quartet after John Jr.'s passing. But in this performance, what I love about the sound is their smooth vocal tones that they've all got, obviously being related. They've been singing just all their lives. Their dad had a barbershop and was part of a barbershop quartet, and the four brothers would just sing outside their dad's barbershop. And you can tell here the way that their voices blend. They are so accurate with their pitches. And when I'm talking about being accurate with the pitches, sometimes they do all sing the same line, which shows their range, their ability to sing all within the same vocal range, but then also to split their ranges up into more tenor and baritone. So the thing that is essential to get that barbershop quartet sound is the ability to break up these vocals into the different ranges, because when you're playing a chord on any instrument, whether it be guitar or piano, you play different notes, and those notes are always going to ascend from your root note. And that's exactly what's happening with the voices in this performance, but just with these guys on the whole being able to break up chords. And I love it when they break off into their vocals and you'll get the variation of the chord being sung. That's effectively what we're getting here. Just vocal chords, not spelled C-O-R-D-S, but C-H-O-R-D-S, because they are singing individual notes of a chord. So it's great when you hear that seventh just come in, or a ninth as well. We've got a lot of ninth chords. There's even a little bit of diminished action going on in there. I might grab the guitar just quickly to show you some of the chords, but I haven't worked them out. It will just be a general gist of what's going on. Getting roughly into what's being played here by Norman, we have F sharp as our key. And it looks like in the intro, he's playing this G sharp minor 7th shape, and he's barring that little finger, or at least playing it on the high E string. And it looks like he's getting all the way up to the 9th fret with that little finger. And as you can see with me, this is where genetics let me down, because my finger is never going to get to that fret in a month of Sundays. But never fear, if you do have smaller hands and you don't have giant hands and very long fingers, you can play your minor 7th shape a little bit higher up here, and you get this. Then you can place the little finger on the B string in order to get that sound, and then we have to have a little shift down. And there's going to be a lot of ninth chords in this progression. It's very jazzy. So that was just stretching up with a little finger like that. And this is the C sharp 9th chord into the F sharp again. And it sounds like we have a little run, something like that, before we then get into the verse. So getting into the verse, I haven't really listened to it really carefully. There's a lot of chord changes in there, but we start on our F sharp, getting into, and this is going to be the D sharp 9th shape, into the G sharp, and then I think we might change to the G sharp minor 7th, into the C sharp 9th, back to the F sharp. There might be a little bit more to it than that before we go back to the F sharp. There might be a little bit more in there. But I think as we progress, there was a B into a C diminished, into just an F sharp, top end of that chord, back into that D sharp ninth, into the G sharp seventh, minor seventh, into, I think then C sharp ninth chord again, to the F. But anyway, that's as I said, it's not going to be an instructional video. I haven't been through it all, but that's kind of the vibe that you want to go for. In terms of the rhythm on this, it is minimal. You want to have your root note and then your chord, kind of like that. So I'll play through those chords. Kind of like that. It's a very loose version of it. So when I mentioned about the voices acting like a chord, this is what you'll have on any instrument such as the F sharp. If we're going through that, and when I mentioned about just hearing a seventh come in or a note that is going to change the sound of the chord that they're effectively singing, what I mean is when we have, for example, that F sharp major chord here, we've got our root note, our fifth, and then the octave of the root note. And what you'll commonly have is your root note, your third, your major third, and you can sing those three notes at the same time and it will give you the sound of a chord. And you can take any of those notes. Range wise, we're going to be at the top end of our chord here. So it means that our notes, for example, taking it from that octave and then taking the third above that and the fifth. So these three strings together, they're making up a chord, but this is what they're doing with their vocals. So when they're singing, you hear just three notes together. Obviously, you've got lyrical content in there as well, which is a bonus, but these guys are nailing these notes dead on. And say, for example, here, one of these notes go down to the seventh. You can hear how it's totally changed. And it's something that you'll hear in the chord progression when we go from the B into the C diminished, into the F sharp. These three notes are notes of a chord, and that's what these guys will be singing. And it's just the basis of the barbershop quartet sound. They are singing in chords, so you get a great sound. Obviously, you've got to be able to nail each of these notes independently, but also you need guys who can sing in the different ranges. So you get one guy who's singing the low notes, you get another guy who's singing the notes in the middle, and finally, in this case, we've got a trio, so you have a guy who's singing the top end in that tenor range. But when we're talking about a quartet, as they started out with 4 of them, then you get 4 of those notes. So it means that if I was doing exactly the same thing as I just did there, you can go all the way up into, and then into the, so you get 4 notes all being sung together, which really fills out the sound, and it just sounds great when you get top singers with voices that blend so well, as these guys' voices do, and they're just hitting the notes dead on, but then they can also just match their ranges in order to hit the same pitch, which they do in this performance as well. So I've just got the piano up on screen, so you guys have a bit of a reference point as to the notes being sung here, and you can see, hopefully, my arrow here. This is where we're spending most of the verse, and where we start the song. So this is going to be our F sharp, and it's an F sharp 3, we also do have a harmony line that comes in a little bit later on, which goes as far as actually over an octave above, because we get to G sharp, which is here. So we have that range of over an octave being shared by these guys as they're singing. And the important thing to point out is that we are getting not just one note at a time, we're getting 3 notes at a time where they're harmonizing with each other, therefore producing this sound of a chord. They've got such control, and we're not really pushing chest voice here and getting up to really high notes in the male tenor range. Like I said earlier, pretty much we're going to be maxing out for the main vocal line going on around F sharp, and that's F sharp 4. And we do have that G sharp 4 in there as well as a harmony line, but that's as high as we're going. But it's all just delivered with such confidence. That's another thing to point out, is that these guys are so confident on stage in front of people performing, and sometimes it's not enough to be just immensely talented. You've got to be able to entertain and have that likability and really be able to connect with an audience just from that performance perspective and the entertainment side of it. And we definitely get that here because these guys are so confident. They're almost putting on a show, telling the story of the song through their mannerisms and the way that they act it out. So we have this transition from the slower first section of the song into now more up-tempo, and we get that swing in there. And just to point out about their vibrato just being on point throughout the whole performance, totally under control. But I also want to point out something about the stylizations that make this sound relaxed and so easy to listen to. But let's have a listen.
Love good. I guess I had $1 million or more. I guess I played the Lord over and over.
So just listening to that vocal delivery where we have $1 million or more. There's so much sliding going on. And because we've got that swing feel to it, the sliding vocal works so well, and it makes it sound relaxed, especially when you've got this relaxed vocal delivery. You've got to have the ability to blend notes in your range, because if you're trying to blend notes and you've got a vocal bridge in there maybe, or should I say a vocal break, obviously you want to bridge those vocal breaks, but where your voice flips into another register, especially when you're going up, that can sometimes happen to guys when they flip into falsetto accidentally, but you need that control of your range and your pitch to blend notes together, and we certainly get that with these guys. All of the great big band singers of the 50s and the 60s, who I haven't covered quite a lot of them on the channel here, but you will find this sliding into notes, having total control of that ability to hit a pitch, not just dead on and go million girls or $1 million or more, and hitting them like steps. The blending between those notes is really part of the art of nailing this big band sound, and all of these guys that could do it had that ability to just ascend to a note and descend to a note. You know where you're going, but they just drag it out. Everybody knows that final destination, but it's going along for the journey. That's the fun part. I just want to play through a bit of the performance now. You can listen out for those slides if you want to in the vocals, but also just look at the delivery of the song, the body language, and telling the story of the song. Like I said, it's not just enough to be immensely talented and have great voices, but it's communicating the story of the song to the audience. So when we're looking at Herbert here with his lead vocal, look at the way that he acts out the performance so that it's even more engaging, but it's telling that story. Let's have a little watch.
I guess I had $1 million or more. I guess I played the Lord over and over. I just quarreled with Sue, and that's why I'm blue. She's gone away and left me just like all dogs do. I'll tell you boys, it's tough to be alone, and it's tough to love a doll that's not your own.
So it's all of those conversational gestures and the things that link in with the lyrical content that make it so natural. And it seems like he's just telling a story, even though obviously he's singing, nailing notes and sliding between notes, got control of his voice and the vibrato the whole time. You just get taken into that story. And that's the point. Just to mention as well that these guys were in a hell of a lot of movies as well. So that side of it, the almost musical theatre and the drama of performance, they were no strangers to. So this is why it is so engaging to watch these guys perform. I do want to cover a little bit of the history. I know that this video has probably gone on for ages, but as you can tell, these guys started singing from a very young age, and this was in the church choir, as well as gathering out the front of their dad's barbershop, as I mentioned before. And they did have a performance at somewhere called May's Opera House, where there was a contest, and this is where it was Harry that forgot his kazoo, and he had to pretend to be a trumpet by using his hands and just covering his mouth and making that noise as they had practiced doing along with the radio. So they went along with the Harold Greenemeyer band for an audition for a radio station. This was in Cincinnati, and it was WLW, the name of the station. But the band weren't hired by the radio station, but the Mills Brothers were. So they became local radio stars, and they got heard by Duke Ellington, and this was their big break because Duke Ellington then called Tommy Rockwell and said to him that they needed to sign these guys to OK Records, which they did. So for a reference point, this was 1930, and they were also played on CBS Radio, who offered them a 3-year contract to have their own radio show. And that meant that they were the first ever African Americans to have their own radio show. They recorded their version of Tiger Rag, released that. It became a nationwide bestseller, sold over 1 million copies, and went to #1 in the charts. They also started appearing in films as early as 1932, and they were signed with Brunswick Records, and they stayed with them until 1934. And another first, they were the first African Americans to perform for British royalty. It was while performing in England that John Jr. became ill, and sadly he died at the beginning of 1936. This is when John Sr., their father, came in to fill in that spot left by John Jr. They were very popular in Europe throughout the late 30s, 1939. This is when, obviously, the war is about to kick off. So they left England just 3 days before war was declared on Germany, and the only boat that they could get, or at least the only destination they could go to at that time, was Australia. So from Australia, they did eventually manage to get back to South America, but it would mean that they didn't get back to the USA until 1941, and that's when Herbert said it felt like people had sort of forgotten about them. So at this point, they were anxious to have a hit because they felt like they'd been out of action for quite a while, and they recorded I'll Be Around in 1943, and that was a hit, but the B-side to that single was Paper Doll. And Paper Doll was just a ridiculously big hit. It turned into their biggest hit, and as I said, it was recorded in 15 minutes, but sold over 6 million copies. They still managed to maintain their popularity and success in the early 50s when the whole rock and roll thing was kicking off. They were also very popular here in the UK. If I Had My Way got to #10 here, and this was still in 1953, and that turned into their 5th million-selling record. In 1956, a few years later, John Sr. Stopped touring. He was 68 years of age at that point, so it was a little bit more difficult for him, so they turned into a trio as the Mills Brothers, and they appeared on TV frequently. This was on talk shows and variety shows. They continued to record and have success into the late 50s as well. Fast forwarding to 1968, this is when they had their final hit, and this was called Cab Driver. They also celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1976, and that event was hosted by Bing Crosby. Sadly, Harry had diabetes and was almost blind due to that at this point. They performed on the oldies circuit at this time up until Harry's death in 1982. Herbert and Donald continued to perform up until Herbert's death in 1989, and Donald would then continue performing with his son, John II, and in 1998 is when Donald was presented with the Grammy Award for Lifetime Achievement, and Donald sadly passed away the next year in 1999. John II toured under the name the Mills Brothers, so continued it going with Elmer Hopper and Don Mills Jr., which is his eldest brother. But it's great to have a look back at these guys performing live quite a while after they burst onto the scene in the 1930s, and having started in the 1920s, they achieved so much considering the times of the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s when rock and roll kicked off, and they still had that success. And just thinking back to society back then as well, how much they must have run into and the amount of roadblocks that would have been in their way from society. But like I mentioned before, the amount of firsts these guys achieved is just amazing. But thank you guys for requesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep their suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock.